Thank you so much. And our panelists for our AI and election mis- and disinformation focused panel. This panel session will explore the intersection of voting rights, AI, and the challenges of election misinformation and disinformation, with an ultimate eye towards safeguarding democracy at every turn. Once our panelists get settled, I will hand it over to our own Professor Alvaro Manrique Bernechea to introduce the modelists and kick us off. Thank you so much.
Is it on? There you go. Okay, good morning everyone. I was going to start with a shoulder roll, but after Dean Nadav's introduction, I don't think that's needed anymore. I think we're pretty much very awake. Thank you all for joining me this morning. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to the reporter for allowing me to be a moderator in this panel this morning, which is such a great panel today. We'll talk about AI technology and election mis- and disinformation. My name is Alvaro Manrique Barrenechea. Say that 3 times in a row. I am I'm an assistant clinical professor here at Vanderbilt University, and I lead the immigration clinic. I have to fill in the shoes from Carla, who left us, but thank you all so much again for joining us. I'm gonna go ahead and let everyone introduce themselves. We get 5 minutes to do it, I'm just kidding. I'll give you all a chance to introduce yourselves and to tell us a little bit more about yourselves and the work that you're doing. Let's start from my side. So if you could start and go ahead.
Absolutely. Push the button? Yes, I got it. Thank you all so much for having me. My name is Isosa Osa. I am the founder and CEO of Onyx Impact. We are a nonprofit focused on researching and fighting disinformation targeting communities of color. I have a voting rights background. I was previously Deputy Executive Director at Fair Fight Action, leading our pro-democracy efforts and our counter-disinformation efforts. And I am proud to say I was born in Nashville, Tennessee.
Hi everyone, it's so wonderful to be here. I just want to thank LDF, I want to thank Vanderbilt Law. I'm Nora Benavidez. I work at the media and tech reform nonprofit Free Press, where I am our senior counsel and director of digital justice and civil rights. That really means that I think about and work with some wonderful colleagues on all of the ways that the online world affects our offline world. Understanding, monitoring, researching, litigating, and working on policy reforms that address disinformation, online manipulation, and the ways that some of us, particularly Black folks, non-English speakers, and other vulnerable users, have less opportunity and access because of their online experiences. So it's just a tremendous honor to be here to get to talk with you about this. I believe that digital civil rights are some of the frontier issues that we have to make relevant for all of us in the work that we do in the broader civil rights movement. I live and work in Atlanta, Georgia, so last night was a wonderful conversation. I hope we can link it as much as possible.
Good morning, my name is Paul Barrett. Thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University's Stern School of Business. And there I do research on the effects of technology on democracy. And that includes looking at questions such as how social media platforms, companies that design and market artificial intelligence systems, and other companies affect the way we vote, the way we relate to one another politically, and so forth. I'm very glad to be here this morning to offer what I can to this wonderful conference.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Ault. I'm a policy counsel with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is a legacy racial justice organization. As policy counsel, I primarily lobby. So I get to spend my time with much less interesting, rich people as the folks in this room. But I get to cover voting rights. I get to cover what we call our digital justice portfolio, as well as courts and nominations. And so a lot of the intersection of my work comes down to essentially taking evidence of algorithmic bias and all of these like technical tools and applying them to traditional civil rights laws and areas, right? How does algorithmic bias actually affect what we consider core civil rights protection in housing, in education, and most importantly for this panel, voting rights. So thank you to Vanderbilt Law School and thank you to LDF for having me here in the Social Justice Reporter. Thrilled to have this conversation.
Thank you all. Sosa, Nora, Paul, Alex, thank you so much for being here. To get us started, I was hoping we could all start with some definitions. And what are some collectively agreed upon definitions about misinformation and disinformation? How do we understand these terms?
Absolutely. So let's get on the same page here. Misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation are the three primary components of the information disorder spectrum. So when we're looking at this, misinformation is false information. And if we look at it from a voting perspective, incorrect polling hours can be misinformation. Now, disinformation requires intent. Another way to talk about it is lies with the intent to lie. So if you are purposefully pushing incorrect polling hours to communities, you are spreading disinformation. And then the last one, malinformation, is true information that is intended to cause harm. Very well-known examples of this are hacking of emails and spreading those emails, doxing, taking people's personal information and spreading them online. And from a voting context, it can be pushing historical or current harms to the communities that have been harmed with the purpose of making it less likely that those communities vote. Trying to dissuade or disengage those audiences with that information.
Thank you so much, Sosa. And as we go through, please, if anybody wants to jump in at any point, feel free to do so. I want to take us, and I don't know, Nora, do you want to jump in on that? Okay, so I just want to take you all into the historical context. I want to make sure that we are all in the same page where historical context happens. And could you provide us the historical context to understand where we are right now in the current technological moment, and how does that affect the relationship with voting rights? And I will let anybody take it.
I'm happy to kick us off, just because we only have so much time together. You know, I remember when I started teaching students about the advent of the digital age, one of the hallmark cases that I taught was the case regarding radio regulation, when George Carlin went on the radio and said any number of swear words. We're not here for a law school class, so I will not get into the actual case, but our digital age and the services, the kinds of tools that we have at our disposal have proliferated at such a rapid rate. And that poses a number of issues. First of all, not all of us use the same services. I still do work at Free Press and just trying to connect people with the internet. We work with tribal communities around the country who are not connected to the internet. And so in sort of the foundational history of this, we're all coming from very different places when it comes to connectivity, and that has a very real effect on the opportunities, the information that we access, and the ways that we think about issues that might influence when, how, and if we vote. Just as we heard last night, there are so many people that are untapped in the way that they may or may not think of issues that connect to them, the way that they may not even resonate that they should go vote, or that they even want to. And much of that now flows from the digital world. Most Americans use Facebook, YouTube, now TikTok, or Instagram as a way to connect with information. And less people around the country are going to local or commercial news sources. This is all in the middle of a waning of local news around the country. Many call it a news desert phenomenon. News outlets have shuttered, much of that based on the advertising model that social media platforms have predicated their business model on. That's not all of it, and we're trying to condense a lot here. But what we've really seen is that people ultimately are getting information from curated platforms that are really not their own experiences. And if I could impart anything today, it would be, how do we build up empowered online experiences for people when the business models of platforms are those that do not have the incentive or the interest in protecting users like you and me and all of us here. And so there's this rich history that sort of undergirds how you and I may see information, what information we see, and that then influences our attitudes and beliefs, as many of these on the panel have researched. I'll let others jump in.
Nora is absolutely brilliant, and I love every time we get to do a panel together, so I just want to start off and say that. And to add what she said, I also think that from a historical context, these things have changed. Titles, they've changed, words have changed as we have gone through history, but in a lot of ways we're talking about propaganda as it relates to voting. And this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. We can go back to Reconstruction and see different types of propaganda be used to try to scare folks from voting, to try to prevent folks from voting. And then we can see over time how different technologies have made that more and more dangerous, to a point where now we have online technologies that make it so easy to make false information proliferate so quickly that the dangers are just something that we haven't seen before. And so whether, this is not going to be new for 2024, a lot of folks know about Russian blacktivist networks in 2020. We all know about the robocalls that happen every single election cycle, the inauthentic persuasion campaigns that we see in a lot of communities of color that have ramped up since the last presidential cycle quite considerably. We know about what we're seeing, the AI images that we have been seeing recently, and how that has also been a form of propaganda for a lot of these audiences. And so, as they say, the reason why disinformation is so effective is because the more times you see something or hear something, the more likely you are to believe that it is true, and the more likely you are to believe that other people believe it's true as well. So the more that we have technology that makes that more and more likely and easier, the more dangerous it will become. But we have to look back and understand that this propaganda campaign against voting has been here for quite a while.
I might add a point that builds on the excellent points that Nora and Sosa have already made, bringing us right up to the moment with artificial intelligence, and specifically generative artificial intelligence, which since late 2022 has been kind of a fascination in Silicon Valley and in popular circles as well. And there is very legitimate reason to be concerned that misinformation and disinformation, as Sosa defined them, will be amplified, turbocharged by these new artificial intelligence programs. However, as both Nora and I have written separately, I think that the main threat to the election in 2024 and to voting rights comes not from the creation of content by generative AI models like ChatGPT and the like, but from more familiar technology in the form of social media platforms that we're familiar with for some years. In other words, by the distribution of false and hateful and violence-inciting content via platforms like Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, and especially X, formerly Twitter. And I think this is largely the result of an extraordinary retreat by those companies from their responsibilities to protecting elections. And the reason this is extraordinary is because of the experience we had in 2020, when we saw our election system threatened in a very specific way by activity that was incited and organized on those very platforms. You would think that companies that cared about their role in society would step up, would invigorate their efforts to protect election integrity. Instead, we have seen the opposite. These companies have actually laid off the people who are responsible for those functions, and simultaneously rescinded some of the policies, incremental policies, partial policies, not sufficient, but at least they were moving in the right direction in 2020. They are now moving in reverse, backing off. We can talk more about sort of speculating about the motivation for this extraordinary backsliding, but I think that's one of, if not the main digital risk as we go into this next election cycle, that we are actually in a weaker position than we were in 2020, and we will see that play out in coming months.
So my fellow panelists have really teed this up really, really well, because as you heard, this isn't a new problem, and we're in a really, really heightened state with the state of social media companies and platform accountability. But one of the things that I want to do is take you in a time machine back to the year 2020 and kind of look at what voter misinfo and disinfo efforts looked like then, as opposed to what we fear is kind of on the cusp of the horizon. I am lucky enough to work at an organization where my colleagues were counsel for the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation. And they were plaintiffs in a case, NCBCP versus Wool. And in that case, two charlatans essentially created a robocall and sent it to 85,000 people. And they did this for $1,000. And those 85,000 people were targeted because they lived in historically black zip codes. The voice actor that they employed, they paid $500 for, who was a black woman, and she told them that if they voted that the man was coming to get them, that they would be forcibly vaccinated, and that creditors would have their information. So playing on racist tropes, playing on systemic inequalities, playing on the particulars of people of color and vulnerable communities. And when I look at that case and I apply it to what has happened just in 4 years technologically, there's a lot of cause for concern. Because, first of all, you don't have to hire a voice actor anymore. You can just create that through AI. And not only can you just create that targeting of zip codes, you can buy individual data on people for 9 cents from a data broker. And you can take that information and you can run it through AI tools and algorithms to micro-target, like you've heard about in Cambridge Analytica or others. But essentially, saying not only like we're going to target people in the zip code, but we're going to target you by being a sports fan of a particular team, or living on a particular block, or having a particular shared interest. The other thing is, with the advent of deepfake and particularly voice cloning, that call doesn't have to come from just somebody who sounds like you. That call could be from Oprah Winfrey or Barack Obama or Derrick Henry, right? If you're particularly trying to apply something to Nashville. And so we worry about kind of the fact case and that pattern and what the technology allows us to do. We are still in kind of negotiations over, we won that case, but we're still in negotiations of what the remedy is to kind of heal the harm of what those charlatans did in terms of dissuading people from voting, and it's 4 years later. The reoccurring problem, as I'm sure so many of our panelists will tell you in election, is the harm before an election is so hard to alleviate compared to what a remedy after the fact. And these AI tools both supercharge the quantity and the particularity of the attack on an election. And so that's what we're worried about. The second thing that I think Paul alluded to is, if you're getting calls from Oprah Winfrey or Barack Obama, particularly targeted at you, by the third or fifth one, why would you ever pick up the phone?
Yeah.
And why would you believe anything? And so I think that goes right back to Nora's point about local journalism and trusted messengers.
Thank you all, and yeah, I am guilty of never picking up my phone. So I totally understand that. I can relate to that. And I feel like we've jumped to the challenges, the current challenges and risks of this. How might this risk affect Black and brown folks specifically, and voters specifically? And what are specific technology around AI regarding civil rights and racial equity implications of this evolving technology? I don't know if anybody wants to jump into that and tell us a little bit, and also maybe from a perspective of the South, right? Like we're in the South, how is that, is it more vulnerable? How are we experiencing that in this part of the region?
So I think that to kind of summarize what a lot of the panel has said here, what we are seeing happening across the world is that the cost of spreading disinformation is approaching zero, with many bad actors actually being paid to spread disinformation, while the cost of accessing truth continues to increase, whether it be how much does it cost to get a subscription to a local newspaper or national newspaper, how hard do we have to search to find trusted messengers. All these types of things are making it harder and harder to find truth. And so we are sitting here at an inherent disadvantage. And so when I think about communities of color in the 2024 cycle in particular, one of the things I'm quite concerned about is that there is a very genuine level of discontent in a lot of communities of color right now, and a lot of Black communities right now. And that discontent creates an incredibly fertile environment for disinformation to spread. And so what we are already seeing is a massive increase in inauthentic persuasion campaigns, targeted persuasion campaigns, to make it more likely that communities of color don't vote, make it more likely that they don't participate civically at all, and persuade them to vote against their interests. And so one of the things that we need to figure out is how to identify these inauthentic persuasion campaigns, call them out, and disband them. And as we're looking in the South, a lot of folks, you would be surprised how many conversations I have on a daily basis as to like why are some of your target states Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina at Onyx Impact? And I'm like, well, Onyx means Black. But when I think there was an article like a month ago on Russian separatist campaigns in the United States, and one of their main targets was Mississippi, were the Black communities in Mississippi, because they were looking for where they could, have the most impact in a particular community. And so we have seen historically Russian separatist campaigns actually be very successful, especially when you're talking about the Cold War. And the fact that they are pushing those same types of inauthentic persuasion campaigns in Mississippi should be of concern. The fact that, I can go on Spiritual World or the Shade Room and see pro-Putin content being pushed at least once a month. And you're just like, what, this is not your audience. Why are these types of things being pushed? So these are all concerns that we have going into 2024 election, especially as it relates to communities of color.
In 2016, the most viral and engaged post about the 2016 election was an article that said the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. It was, like all great disinformation, based on a small kernel of truth, which was the Pope had really been interviewed. And the Pope had really used the names Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And the Pope had really talked about them. That interview was spliced up and his quotations were sort of put together, in an amalgam comment was formed that he endorsed one candidate over another. It was on Facebook the single most viewed, engaged, commented, liked post during that election period. I would say that our information environments have changed, and the political environment has changed. And vis-a-vis Black and brown folks online, the risks are no different because oppression knows no boundary, but the tools and the tactics now to oppress are different. And they actually kind of go on autopilot, I would argue now. We've set in motion these manipulation campaigns online with very little guardrails. And as Paul mentioned, a lot of the work that he and I do examines how these guardrails are falling apart and how the platforms that are most relevant for everyday people are stepping back from what they previously had committed to in 2016, 2020, 22, to the point where we are in a far weaker position now than we've ever been. That affects everyone, but it of course affects the users that are least considered or considered least valuable in some way by our large information environments. And those are minority groups, those are non-English speakers, those are the users that in everyday real world environments are also considered in some way less valuable. That is predicated on centuries of history in this country and around the world. I'll name one other risk that I really think will affect Black and brown voters, and that is, I'll try to tie what seem like maybe two unrelated things together. This year is unique in the digital landscape because of a number of offensive tactics that various platforms and lawmakers are initiating to chill tech accountability. And so you might ask, well, how does that relate to Black folks voting? I hope I can tie it together, so we'll see. Earlier this year and in 2023, several things happened. One, Jim Jordan, member of Congress, initiated a set of subpoenas against the FTC and researchers who study disinformation, targeting them with claims that they were in some way promoting and funded by large disinformation networks. Much of those attacks has resulted in a retreat and a kind of chilling effect for researchers that study what's happening on platforms. Many funders have actually rescinded their funding for this type of research. And so paired with platforms firing people who do content moderation, rolling back policies that would moderate the big lie, we're seeing less and less appetite and courage to do the research investigating what's really happening on platforms. Elon Musk, as another force in the middle of all of this, has gone after researchers who document how his decisions have made Twitter, now X, a more hateful and toxic environment. What's good is that the lawsuits that he has initiated have actually been dismissed in court. His most recent one was dismissed last week. A judge very powerfully said, this clearly appears like he is going after the speech of people who do that research. And then the final force here is that—
Hold on, Nora, I just want to underline the chilling effect of the broader research community at this moment is massive, And like this is going to not only affect 2024, but elections to come. Like what you're saying on these lawsuits, the lack of funding, this broader fear campaign against the folks that are trying to hold these tech companies accountable. It's just such a big story right now.
After October 7th, I personally have never seen people polarize and become as divided online as fast as ever. And researchers are walking back from the kind of work they did documenting the algorithmic components of how that happens. Not public or personal attitudes, but just as Alex sort of walked you through the choices that platforms make that result in Alex never seeing what Nora posts, or Paul rabbit-holing into a series of attitudes and content that have nothing to do with any of the issues of the day. We have less and less insight into those practices by social media platforms. And so it ultimately means that the general lack of transparency we once dealt with is now such total opacity that we're living in what feels almost like a blind environment to even diagnose what you or I or any one of us is seeing online. And that means that the experiences of Black users, of Spanish-speaking Latino users, of AAPI communities remain elusive to us. And we do not know then how to provide defensive interventions to try to reach people and help explain something might be false. Or even if it isn't false, to say, well, why do you believe that? That actually has nothing to do with the election. It's just become a kind of Wild West for us. And so I think we have to understand large forces that are trying to disconnect us from each other and to promote distrust in institutions is working. And underlying all of that, the minimal guardrails we have in place are coming off.
Let me add another sort of strain or flavor of disinformation, or maybe more bluntly, just propaganda aimed not at communities of color, but primarily at white audiences. Before I do that, let me take a step back and talk about the environment in which this is taking place. We've seen over the, since at least 2015, 2016, and former President Trump's first campaign for the White House, a degradation of political discourse in the country, a process spurred primarily by Trump and some of his supporters. It's important to appreciate the genius-level skills that our former president possesses in this regard. He is a unique force in that connection and has had an extraordinary impact in affecting people's understanding of whether they can even understand things, of whether it is possible to determine what's true or not true. And that sets the background environment for a lot of what we're talking about today. And it facilitates a number of phenomena. One of them is the intimidation of misinformation researchers that Nora just talked about. Another one is propaganda aimed at white audiences to persuade them that large numbers of registered voters of color are in fact illegitimately registered. We're familiar with large-scale efforts to push people off the voting rolls in a number of southern states. There is also a more fragmented campaign to get so-called individual citizen activists to take up efforts on a local level to double-check the legitimacy of the registration of non-white voters. And this is being undertaken by organizations which have direct ties to Trump's organizations. They have names like the Election Integrity Network, which is run by a lawyer named Cleta Mitchell, who was directly involved in former President Trump's efforts to delegitimize the elections in places like Georgia in 2020, and her Election Integrity Network is now supporting and spreading the word about digital programs with, one of them is called Eagle AI. In fact, it's not even actually AI, but everyone likes to call everything AI now to make it sound more impressive. But Eagle AI is, it's just Eagle Eye now? Eagle Eye. I see. Okay. But it's spelled AI, right? Yeah, okay. I'm not sure where that gets them, but whatever. But it's no joking matter. This is basically a almost like a spreadsheet that allows people to feed in local voter registration information and help them in a cockamamie incorrect way, identify people who they claim are not legitimately voted, not legitimately registered, to go to their local election boards and say, we want the following people. Here's a list of people presented to you in digital form who we want to see knocked off the rolls now. And you have, as I say, these citizen activists activated by groups like the Election Integrity Network and their allies, the creators of things like Eagle, AI, or I, or whatever. And this is underway right now in states like Georgia and elsewhere in the South. And it's going on kind of below the radar in most cases. And it's just an illustration that you can't look just at what is being directed at black voters. You have to look at what's being directed, the false information being directed at white voters, to mobilize them to, on an individual level, not even an organizational level, to try to knock black voters off the voting rolls. It's very pernicious, and people have to become aware of it and have to literally oppose it. They have to go and fight with their election boards and get them to say, these people don't know what they're talking about, their technology is baloney, to put it politely, and people who are registered need to be encouraged to vote, not discouraged from voting.
I think Paul brings up a really good point, and Nora and Sosa have really kind of validated this. Look, I want to kind of emphasize, this is a choice. Like, there are solutions here. Algorithmic systems use data about who we are to make recommendations or determinations, right? They're using your pattern of behavior, your identity, your likes and interests, your community to decide things. And that application is not neutral. So when you see Congress suddenly care about AI because they're afraid that they're going to be in a deep fake campaign commercial, right? And Meta unveils a new policy 24 hours before a hearing, which happens every hearing. And they put limits and they say, oh, we're not going to use generative AI for political advertising. They're going into their code and they're making choices about what content is delivered where based on people's characteristics. And when they're sued because housing ads on Meta are discriminatorily targeting, black folks or not offering opportunities to black people, they, as part of that settlement, go in and change their content delivery system to alleviate that harm. But my question, and I said this when I went to Meta and they were talking about their content delivery, why aren't you doing this all of the time? Like why are you okay with discrimination or bias in all of these buckets except 2 months before the election or after the fact when someone holds you accountable? It's a choice that they're making based on the business model.
Yeah, just real quick, this comes back to the point I made earlier, just to use Meta as an example. Yes, they're now, because everyone's fascinated with AI, claiming to make little fiddles at the margin in connection with AI. Much more fundamentally, Meta actually has rescinded a policy that they introduced years ago, saying that you could not use political advertising to challenge the legitimacy of past elections based on just a fraudulent claim that the elections were illegitimate, that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. They had that reasonable policy in place. They have now rescinded it, and guess who takes advantage of this? Donald Trump buying advertising on Meta, saying that he had the election stolen from him in 2020. That is not sort of a neutral or marginal thing. Many, many Americans believe that's true, and if Donald Trump is allowed to buy political advertisements promoting that lie on Meta, a lot of people are going to see it. Why is Meta going backwards?
So I feel like we're touching upon a lot of the social media platforms, and that's where we get so much information. We're basically attacked by things, new trends and everything. I'm curious to know, this panel, if you could tell us a little bit about your takes on what should these companies be doing to curtail these this influences and perhaps try to prevent this from happening?
So I know a lot of other my fellow panelists here will have a very specific and of what each social media company has to do, but I'd like to give kind of a general, broad piece of advice. What I have seen a lot of these companies default to is saying, we're not going to allow any political information to be pushed, or any political advertising close to an election. This is a very dangerous way to deal with the problem. We know that voters need accurate information heading into an election, and there are all types of very good nonprofit organizations that are actively pushing correct polling hours, how to vote, how to make a plan to vote. All these types of things are vital to any get out the vote campaign as elections approach. And they are vital to making sure that folks understand how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. And they're also vital in pushing back against disinformation that's already spread. And so what we saw in 2020 was that a lot of the policies of let's just stop everything actually prevented people from sharing good information to voters in a very harmful way. And we had to go and advocate to these companies of actually you have to be just a tad bit more nuanced. And as Alex said, they have the capability to do so. So what we can't allow to happen is for them to use lawsuits, to use litigation, to use fear tactics as a way to say, we'll just step back and do nothing. Nah, you make these platforms. Now you are responsible for dealing with this harmful information in a responsible manner. You don't get to use all of our data and make billions and billions and billions of dollars off of it and not provide a base level of protection for voters and election workers heading into our next election cycle.
Following the days, there was a very brief period after October 7th where disinformation and misappropriated content, so malinformation, mislabeled things taken from video games purporting to be bombings that were occurring in the Middle East. It was a really condensed, terrifying online experience, and it showed us most recently what happens when platforms do not take up the mantle of platform integrity and when they do so seriously. Elon Musk's solution, primarily after removing platform integrity staff and content moderators and ethical engineers, his solution was to tell users to do the job. He said, well, Community Notes is here, and that's for you guys to use. And they touted that Community Notes was doing an excellent job of really educating people like Wikipedia does. Well, the truth is, people who were using Community Notes in those 3 days were doing it at a minuscule scale relative to the 50 million posts, an estimate, I don't even know if that's accurate, 50 million posts that surged on October 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. That's just one small anecdote of the ways that there is a cultural expectation that users do the work of platforms. And at a very high level, I would say, we have to upend that expectation. Because as Black people know, as Brown and Latino people know, that is an expectation put on us all the time. You do the work, this is a service for you if you can make it down to whatever the agency is and do all of the work for us. And so I think in a really just very high level way, we have to challenge that all the time. Not only that, but platforms have the wherewithal to implement interventions. In 2020, there was so much pressure on social media platforms from many of us that they implemented what were called break glass measures. So measures that would reduce the likelihood of violent, dangerous content from going viral, from many people seeing and engaging with it. And they cut those interventions off right after the election, literally right after it. And so in the period after November 7th of 2020, this kind of dangerous content that mostly promoted insurrection-related activity surged. It reached a fever pitch. And when Frances Haugen, the whistleblower at Facebook, came out the next year, October of 2021, she cited that. She said, we implemented break glass measures. We knew what to do, and we did it, and it prevented the dangerous calls for violence from being seen and engaged with and interacted with.
And I would say, when they took those measures off, there was still a runoff in Georgia. And we saw what the effects of that looked like. Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss saw the effects of what happened when you did not prevent massive election lies, political harassment from spreading. We saw them push Black election workers out of their home into hiding. Death threats that persisted for years and years and years. I remember being on calls with Facebook about, look, these are straight up lies about these 2 Black election workers. Can't you just take them down? And they said, well, if you send us the profiles of Ruby and Shay, we can try to hide them. And I'm like, what is that going to do for all of these lies being spread about them on this platform? Absolutely nothing. And if that is the best you can offer to these 2 Black election workers, then none of you deserve your job.
So at a baseline, at a baseline, I think we're in a really horrible moment where we're playing catch up, clawing our way for demands that we won in 2019. And so when I hear the question of what should platforms do, well, one, put back in place the interventions that we fought for, but those should not be considered wins. Like, just culturally and politically here, we should not pat ourselves on the back for getting the thing that we now all have lost because platforms have seen Elon Musk's lack of loss. And when accountability or the lack of accountability is just a paycheck away, what incentive do platforms have to really put any guardrails in place? I would say, if I had to say one thing, Alvaro, to your question, absolutely reinvest in platform integrity. Reinstate the policies that have been removed and reinstate and now increase staff that are tasked with reviewing content. Those are low-hanging fruit. Those should not be adversarial, controversial demands, and yet they are right now. And they are things where platforms say, well, you know, we're doing our best and we're about to release some generative AI tools to review ads. Well, what about the 40,000 people that have been laid off that were reviewing content flagged? That's the stuff that somehow doesn't seem sexy when we demanded them because they're excited about promoting an AI tool that they're implementing next year.
Yeah, I would add just one piece of context to the important points that Nora made, particularly on the human side of election integrity. These platforms, the scale is too big for humans to keep track of everything, so there's a human component and there's a technological component. But the human component is the one that has been sliced and decimated over the last 18 months, 2 years. But there's a larger context to that, and it connects to the response that you talked about in terms at X about, well, we're doing something, we're having users take care of that problem. This is an industry built on outsourcing. It's the economic genius of social media, the reason why Mark Zuckerberg is a multi-billionaire, Elon Musk the same, etc., is that the content on these platforms costs them nothing. Users provide it. The whole economic model is based on outsourcing in that regard. So is the human filtering process that's necessary to keep these platforms from being just total cesspools of spam and pornography and violence and animal torture. The human content moderators, as they're known, are actually not the employees of these companies. The companies from the beginning outsourced this crucial function, which undergirds everything we're talking about in terms of superintending the platforms. They outsourced that function to other companies whose incentives are all set up to keep costs down. That's pay, benefits, training, advancement, the idea that people who do this important work have any hope of career in this field. And if platforms were to do anything that would, on the human side, to make improvements, it would be to end this outsourcing mindset, to bring this function in-house, to take responsibility for hiring, paying, providing benefits to, and supervising the people who do this work. They have other companies do that in remote circumstances, and as a result, all of this activity is much less effective than it otherwise would be. Are they going to go out now and reverse the massive layoffs that they put in place in recent years? I fear not, but that actually is something they could do. And if they would say that's going to be really expensive, the answer is pretty much what Asosa said, which is, yeah, it's expensive. That's called the cost of doing business responsibly. Maybe you would have half the billions that you have as the founder and owner of the company. You'd still be a billionaire, but you wouldn't own so much of the state of Hawaii. And that would be the cost of doing business. They haven't borne that cost, and this goes back to the founding of the companies in the 2000s.
I want to, in the interest of time, because we could talk about this all day, but Alex, as we move into remedies, I would love to hear your take. You've helped author the Lawyers Committee's Online Civil Rights Act, and I would love for you to share a little bit about the act itself and how does it work in preventing this.
Absolutely. So I want to address kind of the thread from the last one and then connect it to this tool, right? Because we've talked a lot about platform accountability, and we've kind of all alluded to this race to the bottom that all of these companies are doing. You know, Elon Musk set the bar so low, as long as we're just a little bit better, we're fine. And like, that's ridiculous both from a moral perspective and from a business perspective, right? Because as Asosa coined brilliantly, the cost of mis and disinformation is approaching zero. What happens to your platform when only bots are talking to bots, when no one trusts anything online? Like, I just don't see the business perspective long term. But we also know that, you know, these platform accountability measures have been like the tides, in and out, receding kind of according to the whim of these billionaires. And so what we're really interested in at the Lawyers Committee is, okay, how do we get some bright line guardrails in actual law that can affect this market? And so we've spent a lot of time concentrated on the commercial application side of AI. Right? How do you audit AI tools for bias and discrimination at the outset and make affirmative requirements that the people who develop this and the people who deploy this are putting out tools that are safe and effective and aren't going to discriminate against Black people? Because ultimately, we think that's how you get kind of some of the down market stream effects on mis and disinformation, but also algorithmic bias that we see all over other sectors. And so we were tired of going to lawmakers and kind of talking about all these election harms, but also talking about all these other harms that we had seen in kind of education software or healthcare misdiagnosis, et cetera, et cetera. And we put together a bill after talking to LDF, after talking to Free Press, AC, a lot of computer scientists who had helped the Biden administration write the AI executive order. And we basically workshopped what is the legislative solution that we as the civil rights community or we as legacy racial justice orgs want to see here that can actually make these tools give some modicum of potential for Black communities instead of just being a net negative across the board. Look, it's Congress, right? Like, we don't expect a lot right now, but I think that the one thing that's become really clear to us is that we cannot talk about these issues as just technology issues. These are civil rights issues. These affect people's opportunity to vote. And so I think that we're seeing a push through this bill to kind of reclaim the policy space of you don't get to talk about this as just your shiny new AI tool and ignore the harmful effects on the ground that are happening right now. We're going to make this a voting issue. We're going to make this a housing issue. We're going to make this an education issue because that's where the actual impact is.
Great. Thank you so much. Alex, for getting us to kind of the action-oriented piece. We wanted to save time for Q&A, so we'll open it up for Q&A now and circulate a microphone. You can project until I get to you, please.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. I have a question. So Alex, I know you mentioned legislative action. I'm curious about the challenges with that. Can it be argued, thank you actually, can we argue that deepfakes is a form of creativity that's protected under the First Amendment? Is that a sort of challenge that you guys are considering or tackling?
Yes, and you have a lot of experts on this panel who can talk about free expression and First Amendment issues. I think that one of the approaches we've taken, and this is not the only approach, I'm sort of like a yes and in this area, but if you wanted to avoid kind of your thornier First Amendment issues, you could at least look at like some of your like more basic AI labeling, right, issues, or like what the FCC just did. The FCC under the Consumer Telephone Protection Act said no AI voice cloning and robocalls. It's a misleading practice for consumers. Now the downside of that is it's kicking kind of the envelope to state AGs. And if you want to talk about voting rights in the South, you're kind of crossing your finger and hoping that you've got an AG who's willing to tackle this problem. And so I think that's why we're spending more resources kind of at this top line. Like, let's go into tort law. Let's go into consumer protection law. Let's look at these tools kind of at the outset. Not because we think we can stop mis or disinfo as kind of like historically explained by Sosa or Nora, but we can prevent some of the supercharging of technologies as applied to this older problem.
Other questions?
I have a question. May I ask? I had a question about, we're at the League of Women Voters. We're working with Campaign Legal Center and other organizations to reach people who need to get their rights restored, and we're doing it through social media. And we've seen a real drop-off on the response rate since 2020, as far as being able to reach the people that might be interested in getting their rights restored. And one of the things we've thought about is using TikTok, but we're not sure it's going to be there very long. And I was just wondering if it appears that the other social media companies are attacking, are trying to delegitimize TikTok, and there's probably other things going on, and I wondered about your perspectives on that.
I think that the harms of TikTok were known and apparent to all, like when it popped up. And if this is a great example of how difficult it is going to be to kind of legislate this and disinformation. If in 2024, in a election cycle that is going to be dominated by who can we turn out, who can we get enthusiastic about voting, how can we make sure young people vote, if that is when you decide to ban their favorite thing, I have questions about your strategy, whether or not I agree with the underlying cause. So I think it is poorly timed. I think that we should not we cannot move forward in a posture of fear towards generative AI, towards AI tools, towards what have you. Like, we need to also be able to understand, to use, to benefit as well as we are making sure that social media platforms are held accountable. So I would not tell anyone to not use these tools. I would just make sure that you know how to use them responsibly. But as you know, getting to voters is hard, right? Getting a voter to vote is not easy. honestly, when you do it, it's absolutely amazing. The feeling is absolutely amazing, but it's extremely difficult. So whatever you got to do to get in front of those potential voters, to turn them into voters, to make sure they are civically engaged, girl, go right on ahead.
We have time for one last question, and I'll pass it over.
Nora, you mentioned in one of your statements about social media that there were larger forces at work trying to disconnect us. Would you expound on that and tell us what those forces are and what they're trying to disconnect us from?
So you want me to end on a high note? That's what I'm hearing. All right, I got that memo. Well, you know, we haven't talked about some of the downstream impact that disinformation has. We haven't talked about the way that disinformation has fueled lawmakers to introduce anti-democratic legislation. I know we're tight on time, so I'll give you two examples. The big lie, the idea that an election was stolen from Donald Trump, has resulted in over 1,000 proposals around the country in state capitals to narrow voting rights, the ways that people would be able to vote, who's eligible to vote, etc. There have also been hundreds of proposals around how people can protest and demonstrate. That's predicated on a lie as well, that Black people and progressive causes are somehow more criminal, more violent. We've seen that surge after the George Floyd protests and even earlier from the much larger Black Lives Matter movement, tied to Native and environmental protests around pipeline constructions. Today's panel was not about that, but there is a huge infrastructure that has allowed lies and manipulation campaigns to seep into our institutions, into judicial nominations, into the kinds of problematic narratives that pit us against each other. And some of the underlying forces to your question are known, and some are not. And I don't want to be a purveyor of disinformation. I will name the things I know. And there are many that we still are investigating and trying to understand. Of course, at the highest levels, the connections between some of these forces are incredibly well hidden and reserved for echelons of our society that I am not invited to by any means. And I have been viciously attacked online for the work that we do documenting this. I'm by no means the only one. When you get into the business of monitoring and tracking dark money, you are aggressively attacked. And so in the middle of this work, Isosa mentioned very lightly what's happened in harassment and attacks for people who do try to protect elections, what happened in Georgia to Ruby and Shay and others. This is sort of the risk calculus that you take when you take on that work. Many of these forces have tied various leaders together. Funding patterns that are promoted by Leonard Leo, by the Koch brothers, and by other forces that frankly we don't know a lot about. Donald Trump nominated and put in place a few mid-level officials in his White House that have ties to the White Nationalist Party. And one of their goals was to allow and promote white nationalist rhetoric to seep into the administration. From there, many of those relationships have cultivated and sort of encouraged Elon Musk to tie together Trump, Musk, and other forces in Congress, including Jim Jordan. Do we know that they get together and talk about how to disenfranchise Black voters or how to make sure that there are disinformation campaigns that are dividing us? We haven't seen a smoking gun. And so that's where I don't want to say there is a large campaign we know about and it is well documented. But there are crumbs that we put together. Isosa, maybe jokingly, is saying, yes, that's happening. We're really trying to put those pieces together. And I'll just close by saying the reason it's so hidden is because it feels conspiratorial. For me to sit here and tell you there are cross-sector collaborations that we cannot fully know or document that are intentionally excited about removing opportunity and access for the most vulnerable people around the country. It may feel intuitive, it may not feel surprising, but it's very hard to document that. And so our job, I think all of us here, is to rise beyond that and to say, what are the ways that we can connect communities? How do we make sure that every single moment of disenfranchisement is documented so that whether it's the FTC or Congress or litigators here or researchers are able to name that, are able to give it a face? Because when it is faceless, it is incredibly hard to fight.
And to follow up on scripture, this is a large and scary topic. This is a large and scary kind of environment to be in. But if we want to boil down mis and disinformation, the overwhelming amount of it is created to divide on some level, to divide communities, to divide countries, to divide political parties, what have you. And we will take on the work of trying to figure out who is doing it and why. But from what can we do about it, what can we all do about it, when you see content that is disinformation, your first thought should be, who is this content trying to divide? And then your second thought should be, what kind of message of unity can I push back against this with? Not a fact check, not what happened, but like, who are we trying to divide and how can I give them a hug? Right, like that's actually what a lot of disinfo, messaging, pushback kind of boils down to. And so if we think, that is why so much of what we are doing in this room, that's why they're fighting against it, because if you are unified, if you have respect for one another, if you understand where folks are coming from, it is very difficult to push divisive content into those types of communities. So I would really, really encourage all of us to try to find the underlying messages of unity whenever we see this divisive content that can help pull us together at a time where they are trying to do absolutely nothing but divide.
Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing the urgency of the moment, bringing what is clearly intentionally in the dark to light, and also giving us some action items to take with us today. Please join me in thanking our panelists.